perfection. And we do not pretend to have achieved perfection. But we do have a system, and it
I
works.
had this discussion a few years ago with a fellow, I can't say fellow engineer because I'm not really an engineer, I'm not degree qualified or anything. But we were talking about traffic, particularly the traffic around Brisbane, which you can't say is any worse or any better than anywhere else. Actually, you can. It's not really as bad as Melbourne or Sydney. It just starts really early. So, for example, this morning I decided to leave about 10 or 15 minutes earlier, trying to get to work earlier. And by the time I got to North Lakes, which is about 40 minutes down the road from my place, I was already in traffic like this. I was moving a little bit faster. But it was 6:05 in the morning and it was already this slow. Now, this co-worker of mine was complaining about how Brisbane City Council or Queensland Roads, whoever does the roads and all that sort of thing, he was complaining that they weren't keeping traffic fast enough. And I said to him, well, what do you consider to be fast enough? And he said, well, it's got to be a reasonable time to get from my house to work. And I said, well, what's a reasonable time? He said, well, it's too slow at the moment. So there's a little bit of confusion there about why he's upset. And this is a pretty common problem where people complain about things but they don't really know what the solution is. So what would make him happy if he could do the speed limit all the way from his house to work? Because that's pretty unrealistic. Now, there is a way that you could possibly do that. There is a way, well, maybe not necessarily do the speed limit all the way to work, but let's say that robots take over cars. And this is a big thing that's going on at the moment with the Google car, and basically they're turning cars into UAVs. That's unmanned, obviously they're not aerial vehicles, but you know what I mean. So the computer will drive the car. Now, this has a whole range of benefits, and even just the amount of lives saved would potentially be worth the investment of actually getting all of these cars, see all these vehicles that are driving around now, actually linked to one big brain. So they all talk to each other, and collectively they can all travel faster because they know that the car 500 metres up the road is already doing 60 kilometres an hour, which means every car behind that can do 60 kilometres an hour. And because one of them in front reacts to something, like for example a dog runs out on the road or something like that, then the car will be able to brake as fast as possible, and the car behind that will be able to brake as fast as possible, because they're all thinking at the speed of a computer rather than the speed of one person, then another person, then another person, then another person. They're all got the same sense, and they're all talking to each other with that same reaction time, which means they'll all be able to stop as fast as possible to avoid that dog. Now, the paranoid cynic in me says that that's a bad thing. And the romantic car enthusiast in me says that's a bad thing. But the figures, the safety figures, will always say that's a very good thing. And even if there is the possibility that these computers get confused and one makes a mistake, which is kind of remote, no pun intended, if an error actually happens and two cars crash together, there's a pretty good chance that all the other cars around it will avoid that crash, and less people will be hurt as a result of that very remote chance of one computer getting it wrong.
Your choice is simple. Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration.
So if I go back to what I was talking about before, with the other guy complaining and not knowing what the actual problem was, so he didn't have a defined measure of what was a fast enough time to get him to work. Likewise, the push for automotive safety has no limits. Technically, it would be 0 injuries. That would be the goal. That's what they always say, 0 harm. But then, as I've mentioned before, every function has a cost. And perhaps 0 harm. The cost is giving up your freedom, giving up your control. And is that worth it? An enthusiast would say no, because we'd like to have our control. It's a funny little grey area there too, because Adam, I don't know how to say your last name, Adam, sorry, Barrera, maybe? High mileage on Twitter or Instagram, wherever you find him, he's all over the place. He's always talking about the culture and the brotherhood of car fans and enthusiasts. Particularly, he talks a lot about Isuzu, because he drives an Isuzu, and I guess there's a lot of them that he likes. But he's always saying about it's not what brand it is, it's about being together in the unity of the actual culture itself. Now, would you still have that unity? Would you still have that culture if control of the vehicle was lost? Some cynics would already say that car culture is dead because those cynics are now getting older and they don't appreciate the other things that have come out of modern motor cars. And the things that created their community those years ago or decades ago, those things that got them together, like the capacity to be able to tune a carburetor, which allegedly is quite difficult. I got no idea because I can never do one. All these things that people used to do to get together for car culture is now gone because a lot of the control for the tuning engines is, I guess, been taken away from the regular backyard modifier or car owner and has been put in the hands of people who know how to run the appropriate computer program or plug into the vehicle control computer or whatever, the ECU. But really, that sort of stuff can still happen, and people still tune their cars by plugging laptops into it. It's just a different thing, and they don't necessarily get scraped knuckles like they used to in the olden days. But conversely, they do still get scraped knuckles, and people are sticking massive turbos on things and blowing tyres and smashing diffs at probably a much faster rate than in the good old days of car culture. So right now, even though it was perceived for car culture to have died because everything these days on the road is such a cookie cutter basic type car, like at the moment I'm in a Cruise, this is the base model Cruise. In front of me is a Toyota Corolla, which is the base model Corolla. They both have 1.8 litre, 4-cylinder, normally aspirated petrol engines with between 102 and 107 kilowatts. These two are really that closely aligned together. See what's behind me? Well, there's a truck, we'll ignore that one. There's a Nissan Pulsar, which is a 1.6, which has about 8 kilowatts less. And that's like a 10-year-old car. So all these cars are all getting very similar. And that's not to say in the olden days they didn't have cookie cutter cars, because they did. They had the same sort of problems. It's just that they were perceived to be easier to modify. Really, modern cars have just as much opportunity to hook up a bunch of people from different type of environments to be able to come together and appreciate each other's car. So again, when the Google car comes out, takes away this thing, and just leaves you with this thing, is that going to be enough to build a community? And no, you can't ride around on fixies because they're too dangerous and they'll be banned by then. Either that, or the computers will be programmed to avoid people on fixies, so they'll have, like, you know, these radar sensor eyes to detect fixies and then try and not run people over. Imagine if the Pedestrian Council of Australia, I think that's what they're called, imagine their input to the programming of a car. It will always have to avoid a person. They'll constantly be scanning the road to make sure that nobody's going to cross the street in front of the car, put the brakes on. It'll have to avoid people all the time. That means pedestrians will just be able to walk out in the street and just stop traffic. And no one will be able to get angry at them because the computer will be just responding to programming.
This earth of yours will be reduced to a burned out cinder.